Welcome to an in-training webinar from InAlliance. My name is Darius Brica. I'm a principal with InAlliance. The title of our session today is The Basics of the National Register of Historic Places. And this is actually a re-recorded webinar because the live session had so many technical issues. So we're re-recording it for everyone's benefit. Let's begin with the official definition of the National Register of Historic Places, or the National Register for short. This is from the National Park Service. The National Register of Historic Places is the official list of the nation's historic places worthy of preservation. Authorized by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, the National Park Service's National Register of Historic Places is part of a national program to coordinate and support public and private efforts to identify, evaluate, and protect America's historic and archaeological resources. This is a great definition, but it does present a potential problem, particularly through one of the phrases, this one being worthy of preservation. That first sentence may be misinterpreted to imply that places not listed in the National Register are not worthy of preservation, which is obviously incorrect. The National Register of Historic Places doesn't provide properties with historic significance. It merely recognizes a property's historic significance. In other words, a place already is or isn't significant in the National Register is just an official way of making that significance known, recognizing it by listing in the register. Also, another way to look at the National Register is that as much as it recognizes actual places, it also recognizes the efforts of people who nominate the resources to the National Register. So this phrase, worthy of preservation, really isn't fair to resources that haven't undergone the evaluation or the nomination processes to figure out whether they qualify for the National Register. And it's absolutely untrue that if something isn't listed in the register, that it's insignificant. So that particular phrase is troublesome. But the National Register in general is a great program, and there are over 86,000 total listings nationwide, constituting over 1.5 million total contributing resources. The National Register is a wonderful program. I can't think of another program that can recognize such a vast array of historic resources in America. These range from prehistoric Indian mounds to Italianate mansions. They could be 1890s train stations or 1950s modern apartment complexes, or governmental resources such as WPA post offices, or mid-20th century roadside attractions such as this water tower in the shape of a ketchup bottle in Collinsville, Illinois. Furthermore, there is a general rule of thumb for a consideration on the National Register, and it's the 50-year rule. So a property has to be at least 50 years old in order to be considered. But rules are meant to be broken. And if you remember the first opening slide, which showed the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, that resource was only 22 years old when it became a National Historic Landmark in 1987. So the 50-year rule is actually more of a guideline than a hard rule. In terms of types of National Register listings, there are several ways to nominate a resource. You can pursue an individual listing of a structure, a building, or a ship. In this case, this is the USS Lexington in Corpus Christi, Texas. Or you can nominate a number of resources that are within a geographic boundary, such as a residential district or a commercial district, or a cemetery, as in this case, the Bohemian National Cemetery in Chicago. Another type of listing is kind of a hybrid of the two. It allows you to nominate both individual properties and districts, and it's called a multiple property listing or a multiple property submission. An example of that is a nomination for cast iron facades in Baltimore. So here, in this instance, we have these scattered examples that are thematically related with unrelated resources in between, and through a thematic or multiple property listing we can recognize these kinds of resources that are not in a contiguous geographic area. Another example with a much wider context is a document for historic residential suburbs in the United States, 1830 to 1960. So through that document, many places and districts can be nominated. So the multiple property listing is a very useful tool. In addition to meeting the age and integrity requirements, a property has to be historically significant under at least one criterion in order to be considered for listing in the National Register. The four criteria are A, associations with events or activities. So an example of that would be a Civil War battlefield site, or significance of a downtown district for being a commercial center of activity for a particular community. Criterion B is related to significance of a property as it relates to significant persons. So an example of that could be a residence of a president. Criterion C has to do with architecture and engineering. So if a property is a particularly great example of a specific architectural style, is the work of an architectural master, or is an example of a unique type of engineering or an important type of engineering, it would qualify under criterion C. And the last but not least is criterion D, which has potential to yield information about history or prehistory, so it typically refers to archaeological sites. So once again, a property has to be at least significant under at least one criterion. It typically is significant under multiple criteria, but in those instances you have to prove the significance separately for each criterion. So sometimes it's more expedient and efficient to decide on one criterion and make the case for that, because it only has to qualify under one. Additionally, there are levels of significance that need to be considered which relate to the geography of a resource. So, and that's another aspect of the National Register that I think it's particularly great, because it allows properties to be considered starting at the local level. So we don't have to compare things in small communities, for example, to places in big cities where conditions and significance levels may vary. We can do that, and that's not to say that there aren't national historic landmarks even in smaller communities, but we don't have to. We only have to look within the confines of a particular boundary, particular community, in order to determine whether a place has significance. So this is an example of a local Masonic Lodge in Vermont, Illinois, a very small community, which is significant under criterion A for its associations with a Masonic Lodge, and also under criterion C for having a wonderful high Victorian Gothic pressed metal facade. Now the significance goes up from there. You can have resources that have significance beyond a local level. An example of that would be a state capitol, which would have a statewide level of significance. And then from there we have a national level of significance, and this is the Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois, designed by Mies van der Rohe, which is an important architect, and this is one of his masterworks. So this building has a national level of significance, and in fact it is also a national historic landmark. And the national level of significance is a prerequisite for consideration in the NHL program. There are many benefits of the National Register listing. In fact, I don't think that there are real disadvantages, but we'll address those in a minute. The most obvious benefit of pursuing a listing in the register is the prestige that's associated with it. This is a program that is meant to recognize the importance of historic places in America, and many owners and communities are proud of that fact and pursue listing in the register for that very reason. It's an honor to be listed in the National Register. Another benefit is the potential of heritage tourism that the National Register listing can provide. Many people more and more travel and seek out places that are authentic, real places that tell real stories. And as such, the National Register, which already recognizes this authenticity, is a great marketing tool, and many communities and historic sites utilize National Register listings to promote themselves to this segment of the population that seek out these very places. The additional benefits, protection and economic benefits, will be discussed separately on additional slides. So under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, any activity that receives federal funds, licenses, or permits must be reviewed to determine whether it will negatively affect any historic resources. Many states also have their own laws that dovetail with Section 106, which means that most federal or state activities will trigger this kind of review. What's important to remember is that historic resources are defined as eligible for National Register listing, and furthermore that such determinations are made by appropriate agencies at the time of review, and that review recurs or occurs independently of any other efforts or activities. In other words, regardless of whether a place is considered historic, it is reviewed, and the determination of whether it is historic, i.e. eligible for National Register listing, is made at the time of review. So communities that shy away from National Register listings in order to avoid being put on the radar of some governmental agencies are really doing themselves disservice, because there are many benefits of pursuing a listing in the register, and those reviews that they're trying to avoid are going to occur anyway. Further level of protection could be afforded under some building codes that are friendly towards historic properties, which are defined as listed in the National Register. They may provide for some exemptions from meeting certain requirements that would destroy character-defining features. Those kinds of decisions are ultimately done through the State Historic Preservation Office. They don't come up very often, but it is a level of protection that is afforded to National Register properties. And then the last level of protection, which I think is in fact the most important, is through a simple fact that when a place is, or a group of places are listed in the National Register, that is an indication that a certain group of people care enough about these places, consider them important, and they have undertaken the efforts to get them recognized through a National Register listing. So in that manner, the National Register it becomes part of a community's planning tool and informs everybody else about which places are important to the community. So this is an indirect level of protection, but in fact a very important one. In terms of economic benefits, the staple benefit that's associated with the National Register is the 20% federal historic preservation tax credit, which is available for income-producing properties. And the principle that it works on is that if you meet the criteria and you spend a substantial amount of money, you have to, it has to be a substantial rehab, 20% of your investment will be returned to you as a federal income tax credit. Furthermore, the work must meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, and there are other criteria that we don't have time to get into today, but this tax credit will be discussed in future webinars that we'll be conducting. The federal tax credit is often mirrored by state tax credits, and most states have their own versions. So when a property qualifies for a federal tax credit, it automatically qualifies for a state tax credit, which are also easier to take, easier to manipulate, and potentially even sell. So the benefit that becomes available is increased substantially through state incentives. There are maybe other incentives, such as in Illinois, where there's a property tax assessment freeze for residential properties. Also, National Register properties may be eligible for grants, which generally are reserved for public and non-for-profit entities, but may be available for planning and brick-and-mortar projects. They often require that a property has a higher level of significance beyond local, but even though grants are very competitive, they are available to National Register properties, and so such listings can score a property higher through these grant processes. Are there any real disadvantages of a National Register of Historic Places? Well, there certainly are a lot of myths, so the best way to address these is probably to say what National Register Places is not. So starting with listing places no obligations on private property owners. There are no restrictions on the use, treatment, transfer, or disposition of private property. Owners can demolish properties that are listed in the National Register without any problem. And really the only thing that changes with the National Register listing is that, well, it is on the register at some point, but it doesn't mean that you have to treat the property in any different way than you have before it was listed. Listed buildings are not required to be restored or open to the public. The only public aspect of a National Register listing is that it's a public program, and therefore the listing, the nomination, the photos that accompany the nomination are part of the public record. But if your resource, your building is a private residence, that doesn't mean that you're going to have people showing up at your door, and if they do show up, you don't have to let them in. So there are no requirements of this kind. Furthermore, listing has no impact on the value of a property or the taxes paid on it. Additionally, a property will not be listed if for individual properties the owner objects, or for districts a majority of the property owners object. So people have a way out, but I'm not sure why they would want to, since again there are more advantages, more benefits of listing in the National Register. But if there are objections, these are the owners have a way to prevent, to stop their properties from being listed. Yes, for districts it does require a majority of the owners to object, but let's consider the other side. If majority of the property owners want the listing, then why should that be prevented from happening? And then the last one that I wanted to discuss is one that creates the most confusion. National Register listing does not automatically invoke local historic district zoning or local landmark designation. Those kinds of regulations are done at the local level. So yes, a place, a property can be on the National Register and can also be a local landmark or in a local historic district. And if there are instances, and you may have heard of such, that a property on the register was reviewed by a local commission and an owner was prevented, say, from replacing the windows. Well, that occurs not because of the National Register listing, but because of the local designation. So that's a very important distinction that has to be made when discussing the National Register. So these are the myths, but there are maybe a handful of true disadvantages, and not so much for properties that are listed, but maybe regarding the process itself, or the properties that aren't listed in the register. So first, as soon as the name National Register comes up, you automatically have a ton of assumptions from everybody that you have to deal with. So you have to put up with the many myths and lies that surround the program, and that gets burdensome after a while. Second is this perception of exclusivity that relates to the official definition of the program and this phrase, worthy of preservation. If it's not on the National Register, it must not be that important. That's sometimes the perception, which is absolutely false. Just because it's not on the register, it doesn't mean that it's not important. It may simply mean that it was never evaluated for listing. And even if it doesn't qualify for the National Register, which quite frankly has very specific requirements, does it mean that it has no importance at all and that it shouldn't be considered in another way, perhaps as a local landmark? So that's another area that's potentially problematic. The process of listing tends to be lengthy and bureaucratic because it is reviewed at the state level and at the federal level, and maybe even at the local level if your community is a certified local government. So it takes months in order to complete this process and to navigate through it successfully. And because of that, it often requires professional consulting. It's not an official requirement, and all nominations should be evaluated on equal merit, but because it's so lengthy and bureaucratic and so specific, it sometimes leads to professional consultants being needed in order to complete this. But there are many examples of properties being listed by their owners or by local volunteer groups. So again, it's not something that has to happen every time. How to nominate a resource? I recommend starting with obtaining a preliminary eligibility determination from the State Historic Preservation Office, or from the SHPO for short. This is an important first step that lets you know whether you should pursue the actual nomination process, which is, again, tends to be very lengthy. So by providing some nominal amount of information to the SHPO, you should be able to get a yay or nay on whether your property qualifies. If you get a positive opinion, then you can proceed with the actual nomination form. There are too many steps to get into in this abbreviated format here, but essentially what you're writing is a research paper that describes the physical characteristics of a property or a district, and you're also proving the property's historic significance under one or multiple of the 4 criteria that we discussed earlier. A couple of useful links. The National Park Service National Register website is absolutely chock full of information. It lists all of these requirements, benefits, and so forth that I discussed here. You can find sample nominations there, and also a database where you can search properties that are listed in the register. And also a subset of the website, a separate page that's useful, is a list of all the SHPOs, State Historic Preservation Offices, because you should always begin by contacting your state and figure out what specific requirements and help you can receive from that state. So that concludes the information portion of the webinar. A few upcoming webinars that we'll be presenting is on April 10th, Todd Tracy will discuss how to shape an atmosphere that encourages successful youth entrepreneurship. On April 24th, I will discuss tax credits for building rehabilitation, so the 10%, 50%, and the 20% tax credit. And on May 8th, once again, I will discuss the 20% tax credit exclusively, because there are a lot of other requirements and things to discuss with that particular program. all of that information, the schedule and how to register for these webinars, which again are free of charge, is available on our website at www.inalliance.biz/in-training. And thank you for watching this webinar, and if you have any questions about the National Register or any comments about potential topics that you would like us to present in the future, feel free to contact me at my email address or via telephone number, and we look forward to receiving your feedback, and we hope that you found this webinar useful, and we also hope that you will participate in our upcoming sessions. Thank you very much.